There are two big things going on. The first is that geopolitics is reasserting itself with a vengeance as the post-Cold War system finally comes to an end. The Americans created the globalized network in order to bribe up an alliance to fight the Soviets, and we've been losing interest in it ever since, with Biden being the most populist president we've ever elected, at least in economic terms. And without the networks that support global trade, we don't have global trade. Now, for the Americans, this can be done. We're not a trading country outside of our NAFTA partners. But for everyone else who's built their system on international access to raw materials, energy, and finished goods market, it's a bit of a kiss of death. The second big feature is demographics. As the world globalized, we also industrialized and urbanized. And when you move off the farm and into town, you have fewer kids. You play that forward 75 years, and it's not that we're running out of children. In most of the world, that happened 30, 40 years ago. It's that now we're running out of working-aged adults. So we don't even have an economic model that theoretically can work with the environment that we're about to be in. There's a million things that go into answering that, so I'm not sure I have a conclusive answer. I can tell you that as the world has aged demographically, capital has been available at greater volumes with greater ease at lower rates than any time in human history, and that pretty much defines the last 15, 20 years. And now the people who generated all that capital, the baby boomers as they were moving towards retirement, are moving into retirement. And so the capital costs were always going to skyrocket about right now and continue rising at least into the mid-2030s. So we have 15, 20 years of incredibly cheap capital that we now have to process through. And if you look at just the raw data, the United States is probably okay. We seem to have at least learned most of the lesson from the 2008 financial crisis, but Australia hasn't. Australian credit has risen by a factor of 7 since the year 2000. In the case of India, you're talking about 14. In the case of China, you're talking 34. So the idea that we can kind of let the air out of some of these financial bubbles without them popping is probably a bit of a stretch, but the story is absolutely not going to be the same everywhere. Whenever Trump says something sensationalist but gives no context or details, it's really hard to do anything except for guess. And whenever we guess, since he literally made it up on the cuff, we generally end up with nothing that can be churned out. His exact words were nuclear warming, not nuclear war.
Right.
So he is running for president again. And if his pattern from the last time he ran for president holds true, he's going to say a lot of things that he will then drop within hours and say something that directly contradicts it to the next audience. And if past his prologue, his fans don't care. It's two things that come from the same series of events with the Ukraine war. So politically, even if the Ukrainians succeed with this spring offensive in ejecting the Russians from all of their territory, that doesn't stop the war. From the Russian point of view, the war will not end until such time as they have an external crustal defense again, and that's not in Ukraine, that's in Poland and Romania. So for the Russians, Ukraine was always nothing more than the first step, and there's another wave once they're done with Ukraine. But the reverse is true too. Because the Ukrainians know that the Russians will never stop, the Ukrainians, if they're successful, will have to go into Russia and defang its logistic capability so it can't invade. So one way or another, the Russians are either moving into Poland or the Ukrainians are moving to Russia proper. And so we're only at the very beginning of what is going to continue to be a nuclear flashpoint for quite some time. That's piece one. Piece two, without foreign tech and especially foreign workers in the Russian system, their demographic and economic collapse over the last 30 years means that they're having problems maintaining the basic infrastructure that produces a lot of the commodities that the world depends upon. Now, we've all heard the stories of oil, natural gas, and wheat, and I don't mean to suggest none of those are important. They're all important. But the one I'm most concerned about is the variety of fertilizers that the Russian space produces for export, because Russia plus Belarus collectively, they are the world's top supplier of fertilizer as a group. And without them, we cannot support a planet with 8 billion people. Well, I would start by saying that the United States banking sector tends to be among the more healthy ones in the world. And if half of our banks really are insolvent, we're all screwed and it doesn't matter what you do. I happen to not believe that report at all. The idea that there's a lot of stress in the banking sector, that's obviously true. But let me dial this back a little bit and put a couple of things into context. Think about what tech is. Think about what Silicon Valley is. The whole idea is you put a bunch of 20 and 30 somethings into a network if they're not physically in contact with one another, and you pay them to think up things that don't exist. And then you pay them more to figure out how to make those things exist. And then you pay them more to prototype those technologies and even more to operationalize them. And only then do you start building them out throughout society. You don't get money back from any of that. That is all done on credit. And so you have to have a financial system that is deep, that is liquid, and finance has to be easy to come by and above all cheap. And that is exactly the environment we have been in the United States since roughly 1995, largely because the baby boomers have been nearing retirement, but haven't reached retirement yet. What changed last year is we hit majority retirement for the baby boomers. And we've always known that this was coming. We've always known that that money was going away, and now most of it has. And so as a result, we've seen the steepest increase in capital costs in the history of my country. And lo and behold, Silicon Valley got hammered. We won't see the same pace of technological advancement again until such time as we have cheap capital again. That will not happen until we have a new mature worker generation that has not yet retired. That will be the millennials in the 2030s and 40s. We have had 4 banks in the United States go bust. Every single one of them was affiliated with the tech sector. That's to be expected. The fact that only 4 went bust is actually kind of a surprise to me. And if you look at the wider economy, the sharpest increase in capital costs we've ever had, not one went bust. Is everyone under stress? Sure, you can't change capital costs that suddenly without stress. But as Donald Rumsfeld used to say, that's a known known. This is what the Federal Reserve was built to deal with, and it has tools for this. Does that mean other banks aren't going to go? Not what I'm saying. I'm saying at this point in the cycle, or super cycle, which is probably a more appropriate term here, the damage really is held to just a couple of sectors, with tech at the top of the list, real estate's probably second. So far, purchasing power is holding up, consumer activity is holding up, property prices are mostly holding up. I don't want to say a recession is impossible in my country, but so far, things look okay. Well, let me start by saying I never want the Federal Reserve's job, so I'm not going to be one of those armchair pundits who questions their every motion, because I don't think I could do better. I will say that most of the reduction in inflation that we have seen to this point is probably not actually due to the Fed. It's because we're now quite a ways past COVID. Remember that from roughly 2020 until mid-2021, we were having significant whiplashes in demand globally. Every time we got a new variant, every time we got a new vaccine policy, every time something changed, what we consumed, the patterns shifted. And it took about 18 months with each shift for industry to change the manufacturing supply chains to catch up. Well, in the United States, Texas, Arizona, and Florida, they opened up mid-year, and then a few months later, everyone but California followed suit. And then California followed in February of 2022. So yes, those are the dates. Well, we're 18 months past that. So the supply chains have caught up. And so the supply-driven inflation has gone down. That's probably responsible for half of the shift in inflation.